So welcome back to our last part of our day of the Pacific Association of First Nations Women's Truth-Telling Forum. Right now, on the line we have Dr. Eva Jewell, and she is an Anishinaabe Cree from Deshkan Zibing, the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation in Southern Ontario, with paternal I can't say it. I can see all the native names, but I can't say lineage from Oneida Nation of the Thames. Her scholarship supports community-led inquiry on language, governance, and cultural resurgence amongst Anishinaabe communities, as well as within her First Nation. Dr. Jewell is an associate fellow at the Yellowhead Institute and assistant professor of Indigenous feminism in the sociology department of Ryerson University. So let's welcome Dr. Eva Jewell.
Okay, Iguet. Bujo Kinawea, Wawia Bictugan Indigenous cause, Dishkanzi Bing Donjapa, Mayangandodam, Anishinaabe Kwendao, Jaganashi no Swin Eva Jewell. So my name is Eva Jewell. I am, as I said, I am Deshkan Zibing Anishinaabe, and I have paternal lineage from Oneida Nation of the Thames, just across the river. And there's also my great-great-grandmother, who I'll speak about a bit, was Mohawk from Six Nations as well. So I just want to acknowledge all my ancestors and where I'm from. And I am currently situated at, I work currently for a university named for a man who gave rise to the system that we are currently feeling. You know, of course, as Anishinaabe Indigenous peoples, we've known for a long time that that the schools that he had created and produced and informed, we feel the impacts of that. And so as in protest, we've started to call it ex-university. And in fact, on June 6th, his statue was removed from the university by community. And I think that was a really triumphant event. So I just want to start with this scene from my home. This is Chippewas of the Thames First Nation in Southern Ontario. And there's a structure here, and it's a Medewan Lodge that was erected to hold ceremony in 2012 to commemorate the leaders who had fought in this war. And it was the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812. And so the river on which we reside is called the Thames River in English. It's now a Canadian heritage river since its locale was significant in many battles of that war. And the beloved Shawnee leader Tecumseh had assembled dozens of Indigenous nations to fight with the British against the Americans. And he had the vision of establishing an Indian state in the Great Lakes region. And I often wonder what things would be like had Tecumseh's vision, which he shared with so many of our ancestors, had been realized. And it's a state of being that would have reflected our ways of life, our intelligence, our excellence, and our brilliance. And in 1813, he was killed in the Battle of the Thames, about 40 kilometers southwest of this site. And it wasn't long after the end of the War of 1812 that the first industrial schools actually opened. In 1829 marked the beginning of the opening of the Mohawk Institute. Some people say 1828, it's 1828 to 1829. And that Mohawk Institute was located in Six Nations, which is widely considered the first residential school in so-called Canada. And it was before Canada was actually even a country. So after 2012, we had many ceremonies there as well. And it was shortly after that that Idle No More had emerged. And my mother made this sign that said Tecumseh's resurgence. And it reminded me that so many of our ancestors have fought colonialism fiercely, just as we continue to do. And it's a struggle that, you know, many of us wouldn't have taken up if the conditions of colonialism were lifted. And so here is the title of my talk, the talk that Canada is talking now. But the talk that they are now being called to task is actually, they should be walking it, right? They're reckoning, I think, right now. And only time can tell, I think. So I'll tell you more about my work on truth and reconciliation, and I'll couch it in the context of who I am as Anishinaabe and as Onkwanaway. So as I was getting ready for this talk, I thought about the current context, and of course I don't need to explain it here. We've all felt it in the last month. We're survivors, or we're intergenerational survivors, and it's been incredibly heavy. And I suppose that the findings are continuing to shake some Canadians, although some, of course, aggressively going forward tomorrow are not shaken at all. And I think this is something that I and others are observing, of course. And so I know a lot of us have been feeling so many different emotions because we've just been hit with wave after wave of grief mixed with this national conversation about us, and it can be exhausting. And it's in a moment that we are mourning. And our humanity in these spaces is sometimes debated. So some Canadians will want to carry on celebrating tomorrow, denying what happened. And I hope that any of you who are listening today have been able to talk about it or express it in some way, because it's been very difficult. But amidst the cacophony of this moment, one thing is for sure, it's renewed the interest in reconciliation for Canadians. And so I know that there are genuine Canadians who truly want to do the work of truth telling. I work with many of them in my position at Exeter University. I know many of them, and there are tireless advocates for shining light on the ongoing, work of truth telling. And they're committed to embodying structural change. But they're too few and far between, right? So I hope more will take up the task. So reconciliation for many of us as Indigenous peoples is a difficult topic, especially as Indigenous women, because we continue to face and feel the brunt of settler colonialism on our bodies. And this emerges through missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and this emerges as the child welfare system and the over-incarceration of our populations. And so this topic of reconciliation is so difficult when we know that the conditions that that continue to oppress us are still in place, right? And so there's this, some people may feel hope, there's caution, and there's outright rejection until the truth is more widely understood and the actions of Canadians meet their sorrow and their nice words. And the Canadian, sentiment it's a spectrum of feelings, ranging from denialism to sorrow to immobilized grief. And it's a lot to manage. And in fact, that's actually what reconciliation is. It's actually a management of feelings. And this is from Audrey Simpson, who's a Kanien'kehá:ka Haga scholar. And she characterizes reconciliation as a matter of emotional management for Canadians. So on one end, reconciliation represents this Canadian hope, this optimism, and this unity, the really nice, the niceties that Canadians like to to present to the world. But on this other hand, we have, cynicism, wariness, and this mistrust on the part of Indigenous peoples that's rooted in a past and an ongoing reality that's riddled with injustice. And it's true that these injustices continue because settler colonialism is actually an everyday project. So reconcile implies that we are acknowledging a noble history, just one that, as Audrey Simpson talks about, is contaminated by force. That there was this moment somewhere along in our history that there was a relationship that was good. And we can return there, with reconciliation, with enough resourcefulness and goodwill and, and gumption and good old Canadian, and politeness. And maybe it's this moment we actually see here on the screen. This image of Europeans listening intently to an Anishinaabe diplomat speaking their terms of the relationship. But to understand this, as I've come to learn, there was actually never a moment in our first encounters that there was an intent to foster an equitable relationship. dispossession, violence, and colonization, which are some of the classic indicators of imperialism. That was always the bigger plan. And it was evident even in those first encounters. So to understand this, I want to talk a bit about this idea of misopity. And I want to talk a little bit about patriarchy. And so these are, as Toby Rollo describes, misopity is the denigration of childhood. And many feminist scholars, of course, have described patriarchy as a political order where power is consolidated amongst men and masculinity. And so political autonomy, or like what was considered political autonomy in Western European thought, was actually characterized by masculinity and adulthood. So anyone who was a man and an adult could and had the ability, or the, I should say the, had the, what's the word I'm looking for? The potential, there you go. The potential for civilization, for logic and reason. And that was actually developed and created through faith-based education, right? So in short, adult men who possessed an identifiable reason, speech, and maturity were considered political subjects. And anyone outside of that definition, such as women, children, or any non-European peoples, did not. So upon arrival, European men who were representatives of their societies in this mode of thinking only spoke to Indigenous men, who they characterized as children. And so a big problem when Indigenous societies were, in many cases, matriarchal, right? Or attentive to the equity of genders and political representation. So of course, in the case of my nations, of the Onkwoyomwe people, we were matriarchal. In the case of the Anishinaabe people, we are patrilineal, but still there's an equity that exists amongst gender expression. And so when the Europeans spoke to our ancestors, the Indigenous men, of course, remember they're not talking to women, they likened them to children. They said, you are incapable of political autonomy. And they thought that we woefully lacked logic. And so, sorry, I just lost my spot. Woefully lacked logic. My apologies. There you go. And so they're incapable of political autonomy and woefully lacking logic, or the reason, or the maturity that was ascribed to Europeans, right? And so it was for this reason that you can develop concepts like terra nullius, or empty land, and that anyone lacking political autonomy who are occupying these lands had no ability to maintain them. So this is where the doctrine of discovery comes into play and manifest destiny. And so therefore, they could be dispossessed of their lands to make way for the mature political subjects who were more worthy and deserving of them. And so they looked upon Indigenous peoples with this like stern nostalgia, right? So they looked upon us and said, you're like children. And it's possible to fix children. In fact, they had developed a system that fixes children and brings children into the light of maturity, and that is through faith-based education. It's the same process that Westerners themselves developed to mature their own children into adulthood. And so children under this logic have to be forced into maturity through violence. And it's necessary, and it's actually built into faith-based education. So I wanted to be clear that it's important to frame the residential schools in the context of the creation of the country and the paternalism that Europeans had felt toward our ancestors. And the residential schools, the rise of residential schools are not, of course, unique to Canada, that they occur in Australia and the United States and New Zealand and all settler colonial states. And so I'll talk really quickly about these misopotic, this means the denigration of children, these principles of settler colonialism in Western knowledge. And this comes from a scholar by the name of Toby Rollo. And so he says, logos, which is logic and reason, or sorry, language and reason. And so what this means is that human beings as individuals and as a species progress out of a bestial state of a feral child, of a child who is a beast, into a fully human state through education. And there's something missing from the feral state of the child initially, right? And that is the knowledge that's created by adults. So in this worldview, there's no prior knowledge that children have, which is counter to our worldviews, right? So I'm Anishinaabe, and one of our teachings is that the first knowledge, we come to this world with a knowledge already. And the first knowledge we have is the knowledge of love. So nobody has to be taught the knowledge of love, right? So that just comes inherently. And so it's in stark contrast between what Indigenous peoples had thought about their children and what Europeans had thought about children. And so the central logic of Western Misophobic, of the hatred of children, of childhood, is that language and reason is a human form of relating to the world and others. And it is always understood in clear contrast to children's deficiency or their deficit. So children, like animals, are incapable of reason and thus must yield to those who have capacity for reason. So this is all baked into the ideas, again, around animals and children being less than and actually being equal. And we know in our Indigenous worldviews that that is just simply not even fathomable. We know that our relatives and our kin who are non-human carry with them knowledges that actually have sustained our lives, and we owe so much to our relatives, our non-human relatives. And so Aristotle had this view. Whenever anyone talks about Aristotle, I get like really annoyed, because he had this view that because slaves, women, and children are naturally excluded from political life on the grounds that they possess deficient forms of reason and speech, and this was because they were considered incomplete men, right? So Aristotle had this idea that women have fewer teeth than men, a female is an incomplete male, as it were, and a deformity, in fact. And so these ideas are all rooted in their very ancient knowledge systems. And so through this, we come to concepts like terra nullius, and then as children and slaves are incapable of owning property, right? And because Indigenous peoples were thought of as lacking reason, as akin to children, they were not able to own the land. And so that's why terra nullius, which is still, which has not been repudiated by the Canadian state. So Canada still uses this actual logic that we are children to maintain control over us. And we see that very clearly through the Indian Act. And why are children such, like, why is childhood denigrated so much in Western knowledge, right? And that comes from this idea of the inferiority of dependency, which is very different from how Indigenous peoples conceptualize our worlds. I don't know, I'm pretty sure that this is a pretty common sentiment across and value across Indigenous nations, and that is that we are interdependent on our world. That if you change or shift one part of the cycle of life, you'll affect all of it, right? And this goes down to, like, from the smallest being to, you know, to anything, like the bears, the wolves, like anything, the trees, all of the elements have a place in this world. We describe it as Wawakewin and Nishnabemwin, which is like this idea that everything, everybody has a place in the world. And creator forgets no one or nothing, right? Nothing or no one. And so, but in Western worldview, dependency is seen as inferiority, right? It's seen as an inferior, as a state of inferiority. So your physical and material dependency, even, you know, going as far as to say vulnerability, is resented, and it's considered indicative of this inferior value, this inferior virtue. So this gives rise to this idea of the idea of paterfamilias, right? So this is where patriarchy comes in. So this positions children as the property of their father, and it creates power amongst men based on the idea that children are dependents who cannot exercise genuine agency. And this also is linked to women, because women, of course, give birth to children and are therefore meant to be controlled. And you know, we are doorways to this world. And so if men can control the doorways to the world and the future generations to come, then all of those people, like women and children, will be dependent on men. So Rollo talks about this idea of scholarship and how that's linked to patriarchy and all of these ideas of language and reason and the inferiority of dependency. And that is, to be a scholar was, in a literal sense, to have free time to deliberate. And so it was in the leisure time that was afforded to men because children and women and slaves took up the labor. That they could actually cultivate a newly realized and definitively human form of knowledge and agency. And it's only through education in faith that mankind will progress from the state of worldly sin, right? So that goes back to this idea of original sin towards heavenly grace. So this, you can see now how we're positioning the very small definition of what like a man upholds at the very top, right? At the very top of a triangle or a hierarchy. And nobody actually wants to, and this is in the mind of Western knowledge, nobody actually does this voluntarily, right? Nobody goes to school voluntarily. Nobody leaves their bestial state in a voluntary sense. And they saw this case in point with us, that we refused and didn't want to actually be a part of, we didn't want to abandon our ways of life. So it was important to invoke necessary violence. And that education must be coercive and violent in order to induce or motivate maturity. And this is because, of course, all children are inherently liars, bestial, and feral. So education had to be violent, because there was no other way to motivate or compel an inherently wild being into becoming civilized or rational. And that is, again, from Toby Rollo's Feral Children paper. It's an academic paper, but if you're interested in anything I've talked about here, I highly recommend giving it a read. So if violence is necessary to induce adulthood, to civilize the child like people, you know, to civilize the child like the people who are here. And it's sad and it's tragic, they thought. This is what the colonizers, you know, had thought. This is very sad and tragic, yes, but it's necessary. And so this is why so much of denialism relies on that, the denialism of residential schools. And I'm sure you've heard this or seen it in the comment sections of Canadians saying, you didn't want to be educated, and these schools were for education and things like that, or they weren't that bad, or any, you know, takes like that. So there's so much of that denialism, and it relies on those paternalistic attitudes I just talked about. And so the schools were considered benevolent and good, but the execution was poor. And sure, there were a few bad apples, but that's how it always was back in the day. Right? So these are kind of the tropes we hear in denialism. And Canadians, I've learned, have this, you know, this deep commitment for a national identity that they've made of kindness before anyone pulled that curtain back to see the dirty deeds and the ideology that constructs this country. And Canadians are coming to a reckoning now. And as Audra Simpson states, our present as Indigenous peoples collapses the past. It calls up the past, and we contort to make way for everyone else's present and future. So this Canadian identity, or whatever shaky foundations that it rests upon, is made possible only because Indigenous peoples, specifically women and children who embody indigeneity and reproduce indigeneity, or that is the quality of being Indigenous, or Anishinaabe, or Onkwoyonwe, or however you express your original, your origin in place and land. We paid the ultimate price with our lives, right? And so this is what we are reconciling when we say reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And for that reason, I don't know how much I can I don't know how much I can go down that road of reconciliation, because there's not really ever been a reckoning, and we know that the truth hasn't even been told quite yet. So there was this time when I just want to tell a story really quick. There's this time when I was doing my doctorate work, actually at Royal Roads University on Vancouver Island there. And I had a professor who asked me, what's it like to transcend trauma, you know, in a First Nations community? The trauma of residential school, which ultimately meant, you know, the trauma of being ripped from a self rooted in land and place, where that place remains, right? Like the place of where we are from remains, but this new colonial identity is ascribed to it over what's Canada. That's, you know, like in Vancouver, that's the territory of the Musqueam nation. Sorry, I know many others as well, and the names are escaping me, and my sincere apologies. And so it's just that these new colonial identities are that were purported to civilize us as Indigenous peoples, you know, are now here as a result of the colonial project. And so for a little while, I kind of followed this thread of transcendence. I thought, okay, let's think about it. What does transcendence mean, right? Transcend meaning to just, you know, depart from, or to glide over, or, you know, something like that. And I thought maybe it would provide me or my family or my community and my First Nations some peace, just transcend it all, you know. It sounds so nice, sounds wonderful. But it's actually inconvenient for Canadians, because Indigenous transcendence means the end of the colonial and thereby Canadian structures that harm us daily. And I don't think my prof knew that at the time. I think he meant to transcend into a being that is at peace with the current structures that Canadians benefit from and enjoy every day. He was asking me to reconcile with colonialism. And I truly think that that's kind of where much of the reconciliation discourse was rooted when I was thinking about that, thinking through that, but maybe there will be a shift. But I've yet to see it, and I'll believe it when I see it. So I worry that reconciliation is basically asking us to transcend into what Canada has come to represent for so many people, but Indigenous nations. And I sense then that Canadians want us as Indigenous peoples to transcend somewhere to where we can all agree is a place of mutual peace, where we have reconciled all of this injustice and returned to the sentiment of those original relationships that were so important to Canadians' first presence here in our house, even though we know as Indigenous peoples, they were framed in a paternalistic manner. And so these first relationships were never conciliatory. And to understand the structure of settler colonialism in Canada is to understand that it actually relies on our erasure to make this dream of reconciliation possible. So this erasure is actually, our erasure is built in and woven into the fabric of this country. As Patrick Wolfe states, settler colonizers come to stay. And he uses this analogy of a structure. So if I want to construct a new building in a place where there's already one there, I have to tear the old one down. So I come from Deshkan-Ziping, and it's, of course, it's Chippewas, the Thames First Nation. And I grew up on the grounds of this residential school, the former grounds of this residential school. The building was not there by the time I came along and was growing up. But this was a school that was considered a pilot program that would be a prototype for all residential schools in the country. And it pains me deeply to know that the first experiments of how this system would reverberate into the lives of so many people actually originated in my territory, actually where I grew up. Like I literally grew up on the grounds of this school. So 3 generations of my ancestors passed through this school. My great-great-grandfather Enoch Hill and my great-great-grandmother Gussie Green. I actually just wanted to point out that Diane and I actually share these ancestors, so we're cousins. And so they were among the first generation to pass through the school. And the Reverend at the time, Reverend McVitie, who I believe this is him standing here on the the far right part of this picture here. I could be wrong though. He would later conduct this follow-up research project that would deem them a success because they were good Christians who sent their daughter, who was my great-grandmother, to this school as well. But that convenience of this finding, was that it didn't account for the fact that it was mandated in Canadian law for my great-grandmother to go to that school. So I don't know, you can really see how they stack the evidence to make sure that their narratives around these schools were glowing and benevolent. So to reconcile with this legacy, the truth of which is now only just entering public conversation, I don't think is necessarily possible in my mind. As too many aspects that give rise to these schools currently exist and keep Canada in existence. And one of them is the Indian Act. And so we are asked to reconcile with this past that is both here, and we embody it and live it as Indigenous peoples, and not here, because Canadians are just, it only exists in the minds of Canadians, but not in their experiences. So I want to shift really quickly about to this, can reconciliation even happen without truth? This on genocide. So I was thinking through this, there's a lot of hand wringing going on right now. Was this a genocide? Or even there's the qualifier of cultural genocide. And I thought that there was this really important quote that this person from the 1492 land back claim in Six Nations territory had stated, and his name's Sky Williams. And he stated, what's in those mass graves, right? Those are graves of bodies. They're not massive sites of rattles or drums or poles or cultural items. They're bodies. So this was a genocide. There is the softening of the blow of it saying that this was cultural is Canadian benevolence in action. And so I'll share with you this definition of genocide here on the left. You'll see the UN definition of genocide. And so this comes from the UN's Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And so you'll see here that here are all the things that, the way that genocide is described by the UN. So you have killing members of the group, causing serious bodily harm or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now you'll notice a dubious omission in Canada's definition of genocide. Canada's definition of genocide is that the first two, this is in the Criminal Code of 1985, and that is only defined as killing members of the group or deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. So this is actually why you will see Canadians and Canada structurally refusing to use the word genocide, because it is true, genocide, it is not a genocide in their definition of it, but in the broader international context, what happened to us was in fact a genocide. And I just wanted to address that because I really don't think that we can enter into a discussion about reconciliation or repairing a relationship if there's not even any truth involved in the situation. So can reconciliation happen without truth? So let's talk about settler colonialism. So settler colonialism, it's a structure. It's not a single event. Sometimes, when you're, I have students who I teach at, at X University, I teach an Indigenous Perspectives course. Many of them will talk about the fur trade or the colonial era. And this frames colonization, settler colonialism more specifically, as an event, as when, colonial officials are meeting with our ancestors at the first time, and then, something happened, and then now all of a sudden we have Canada. So this is again where the quote of the building that I talked about earlier comes into play. As I put it, settler colonizers come to stay. Invasion is a structure, it's not an event. Settler colonialism destroys to replace. And so Theodor Herzl, who's the founding father of Zionism, observed in his allegorical manifesto novel, if I wish to substitute a new building for an old one, I must demolish before I construct. And that's precisely what happened to our nations. It is critical to understand Misophobic, or the framing of children, the framing of our nations as children, as political, as lacking political subjecthood to understanding why it is that settler colonialism was enabled and justified, right? And settler colonialism is about the moral obligation of these empires who are, you know, like Western empires who are the adults in the world or the mature political subjects to expand their progressive regimes and, you know, to enlighten those poor bestial societies and bring about rationality. So it's very deeply the hatred of children, the denigration of childhood, and violence is all very much baked into the Canadian structure and settler colonialism. So when Patrick Wolf, he talks about this, the dimensions of settler colonialism, that there is a positive and there's a negative dimension to it. And he's not saying it like it's like positive is a good thing, right? He's saying that there's a production, there's a generating element or a production element to it, and there's a negative or an erasure element of it. So the positive dimension of settler colonialism is that the new colonial society is erected on the expropriated land base. But the negative dimensions are that Indigenous societies are dissolved. So settler colonialism needs to eliminate the pre-existing societies in order to build a new one. And we know, how do you do that? You take their children. You change the way that they think, you change the way that they enact and engage. And so here's that logic of elimination and how it produces. How does settler colonialism make a world, right? A world in which Canada can exist. First, we have miscegenation. It's a fancy word for basically intermarriage. And it's also a word for the official encouragement of intermarriage. So we know in those first encounters, some of the endeavors of those colonizers was to infiltrate nations and to take up Indigenous wives, right? And in fact, we know that the Métis Nation emerges from this, but the Métis Nation, of course, being one that is genuinely and has produced and created conditions that actually create nationhood. So it's not just, it's a complicated subject. I won't go there. This happens through intermarriage, but it also happens through rape, and it happens through control over women and children. So it happens in non-consensual and consensual arrangements. And so the descendants of these unions are, as Wolf puts it, settlers becoming natives, right? And so the structure of patriarchy, where that power is consolidated to men, ensures that official control over women and children will give rise to a society that is characterized by the myth of métissage. And so I don't know if you're privy to like a lot of the conversations that maybe someone like John Ralston Saul has had, and that is, he's saying Canada is a unique country of Métis individuals, meaning that the first settlers came and then they all had children, and it's different than the Métis Nation. Kind of again, like I said, I won't go there. Another world making tactic is to disperse collective title or the collective relationship with land bases into an individual title. And we know that happened through the Indian Act. So that dissolves Indigenous forms of collective stewardship into and translates it into property and ownership. And then to turn Indigenous peoples into wards of the state, and then later as citizens, and of course take their children away. And the child abduction and conversion through residential schools. And then also biocultural assimilation to change the way that we relate to our lands. And this also occurs under the Indian Act and as a result of residential schools. So of course we know that much of our cultural knowledge and land-based knowledge wasn't able to be transferred on to the children because those children were stolen and taken to residential schools. So in short, settler colonialism doesn't just eradicate Indigenous worlds. This isn't just a past thing. It produces new colonial worlds that need Indigenous worlds to die. So that's why it's erroneous to say, this is something I tell my students, to tell Indigenous peoples to get over it. because that current structure of settler colonialism, the ongoing structure that is reified every day and that we as Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women endure daily, relies on the suppression of our worldviews and our lives. So I wanted to move on to this idea of apathy, right? So can reconciliation happen without truth? So let's talk about apathy. So I've said before that you know, I do some media. I've been asked quite a bit to do quite a bit of media in the past month. And so a lot of folks say, like, where do Canadians start? What should they do? One person had asked me something along the lines of, do you think Canadians will be so overwhelmed with all of this, like that they'll just kind of turn off? And I'm like, Canadians have the privilege of being exhausted by Indigenous issues. We as Indigenous peoples, we don't have that luxury, right? So many of us encounter this apathy, this lack of emotion, or the non-caring nature of Canadians who really just aren't listening. They're not paying attention. It's a kind of a so what, or that get over it I just talked about. It's that mentality, right? And it has a systemic cause for sure. Canadian curriculum is not adequately delivering truth or Indigenous perspectives in their classrooms, which is part of the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And those calls to action I'm going to speak about in a little bit. So as an educator, I'll poll my students, you know, about what knowledge they're coming into my courses with, just to get a baseline of what it is that they understand about Indigenous peoples, so I can maybe shift, you know, my course if I need to. And I would say 85 to 90% of them do not have a basic understanding in Indigenous reality. And most will state that they learned about Indigenous peoples in the context of the fur trade, right? So in that event of colonization, that's where they learn about it, right? But I will say that most are very, very keen to learn about Indigenous perspectives. And I have fantastic students at X University, most of whom are not Indigenous, but many of whom are racialized and are very understanding of what our peoples are going through and continue to go through under settler colonialism. So there's a recent survey by the Canadian Race Relation Foundation and the AFN, right? And so they had reported that 2/3 of Canadians who were polled stated that they had not sufficiently learned about Canada's residential school system. And recently in the Toronto Star on June 26th, there was a report on, there was a story that highlighted, you know, took a look at the curriculum, and they asked Dr. Jennifer Brandt, who's pictured here in the inset here, and Dr. Eve Tuck to comment on some of the curriculum that was being delivered in schools. And so here we see this is the site of Canadian myth making. This is the site of the miseducation of Canadians, and this is the source of the apathy that we experience now in moments like these, and why people will aggressively continue celebrating Canada Day tomorrow. And so in this example here, this is directly from a textbook. Residential schools were established in 1883. And Jennifer Brand is like, that's the first one opened, you know, what is that, 60 years before? Some residential schools had already been in operation for over 50 years before the residential school before that system became compulsory. And the last residential school in Canada, this is often stated, closed in 1996, but there are residential schools that were open in 97, and of course, even up to 1998 in the case of Capel in Saskatchewan. And so, you know, this, to pull from invocation writer Siku Olulu, she reads James Baldwin, and she says, this willful amnesia in the context of, this is in the context of slavery and anti-Black racism, but it's applicable here in Indigenous context, Indigenous issues context as well. This willful amnesia is a sinister crime, rendering white citizens ignorant of both self-knowledge and the systemic violence they personally reinforce. And so this is, you know, make no mistake about it, the Canadian government benefits from the miseducation of its citizens and it weaponizes their miseducation as apathy. And so, you know, in a memo from April 2019, and this was obtained by the Access to Information Act, Indigenous Service Canada, the Communication Committee had stated that Indigenous issues lack immediacy for the general public. The memo states that the public environment is crowded with other issues, making it challenging to sustain focus on Indigenous concerns. And so they use that lack of Canadian public interest that they themselves manufactured and Canadians' short attention span to slow the political will to enact change. And you know, it's a phenomenon that where Canadians claim that what our peoples went through and are going through isn't that bad, or claiming that these schools were beneficial to Indigenous children. And without the truth, the broader Canadian public lacks the adequate comprehension about our issues, because everything from the funding structures that Indian Affairs, you know, that we are subjected to under Indian Affairs are incredibly opaque and not at all easy to understand, even for those of us who do research and work in this area. I really don't understand how a lot of these structures work. And that's entirely intentional. And so how can, you know, I don't want to say like, how can we blame Canadians? You know, they benefit very much off of miseducation and apathy as well. And so, you know, there's a case in point, this caller on CBC's Ontario Today, which is the call-in show, you know, the noon hour call-in show on CBC in Ontario, had claimed that COVID, now that COVID is over, first of all, which is not true, the public needs something else to worry about. And so now this issue has been drummed up to stir up the public's rage in the wake of a traumatic global pandemic. And so, of course, this doesn't take into account that we know our nations and our communities have been working tirelessly for years to advocate change. And so, you know, movement on these issues is held hostage by the fact that Canadians don't care, and they don't care by the design of Canada itself. So you can hear my cat meowing in the background. He's, I'm not too sure why he's meowing at me. Okay, so I'm gonna try to get through this really quickly because I realize now I've been, well, maybe I guess I have time. Okay, I'm gonna get through truth commissions and talk about the structure of truth commissions. And so truth commissions are, you know, it's a global phenomenon, right? So truth commissions are central to this emergent notion of the right to truth, defined by the United Nations as the right of the public and individuals to know the truth about gross human rights abuses and these serious violations of international humanitarian law. So what Canada set in motion in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was in fact already an established global structure. And so notable truth and reconciliation commissions, and this is an interesting exercise I did with some of my Indigenous students at a First Nations Technical Institute that I also teach at. And we brought in, the students brought in all these different Truth and Reconciliation Commission reports, and we just compared them to Canada's. And so there are, you know, dozens and dozens of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. So here's a list, I won't name them all, but they occur around the world. Just wanted to give the caveat that the United States Truth and Reconciliation Commissions are state. So the US itself didn't do a full national Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was a state-led, so the state of Maine and the state of North Carolina led their own truth commissions. And so the goal of a truth commission is to hold these public hearings to establish the scale and the impact of a past injustice. This is a quote from Bonnie Eboa, who is a scholar in Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And it involves this wide-scale, it involves, like, the endeavor is to ensure that it makes it part of the permanent, unassailable public record. So truth commissions also officially recognize victims and perpetrators in an effort to move beyond the painful past. Wherever there is an ugly, unresolved injustice pulling at the fabric of a society, there is an opportunity to haul it in public and to deal with it through a truth commission. Truth commissions aren't always legally binding. They don't have the ability to carry on criminal procedures. So this is why you'll see a lot of these commissions just simply hear the truth and write it down, and sometimes don't involve, in the case of Canada at least, any kind of apprehension or, I shouldn't say apprehension, I should say, you know, penalty on the part of the people who perpetuate harm. So of course, these are basics that we know. This is I'm just giving you an insight of what I teach my students, right? So I'll get into some actually unique content, but I just wanted to give this just in the event that people are, just to give some context, right? So of course, we know that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission operated from 2008 to 2015. It examined the impacts of residential schools on Indigenous peoples in Canada and concluded that these schools were cultural genocide. And again, I think what's difficult about when we operate in these structures that are sanctioned and created by the Canadian state is that we are bound to those rules. And so I'm not entirely sure. I've not talked to the commissioners of the reports and why they had concluded with cultural genocide specifically, but I suspect it might be because Canada's definition of genocide itself doesn't include, you know, doesn't include a part that talks about the forced removal of Indigenous children from their families. So again, it's all baked in the design of everything. And of course, we know that it resulted in the 94 calls to action, several of which call for public education on the following topics. So we want to, you know, looking at impacts of colonialism in residential schools and treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous laws, and even Indigenous contributions to society. But Audrey Simpson states that reconciliation in Canada was actually here to heal settlers and politically to keep the Indian Act in place, to heal but one sliver of the problem of settler colonialism, a focus upon the schools rather than the lands, waters, and the endurance of the stability of the Indian Act over time. And this does not at all discount the incredible work of those, you know, I would say, the significant contributions of the people who are operating in the system, like Justice Marie Sinclair and Marie Wilson. And so, you know, forever indebted to the work that they've done. But I think they too, as I understand it, and as I had seen in some of their comments, understood the limitations of these structures. And I don't want to put words in their mouths, but that was my sense that I got after kind of listening to them speak recently. So the 94 calls to action, just, you know, I produced a co-author a report with, no, I'll talk about that in a second. there are two parts of the calls to action, right? So you have legacy, and legacy calls to action are those that seek to address the ongoing structural inequalities that marginalize Indigenous peoples in contemporary Canadian society. So those are the things like ending the education inequities or the health disparities, working towards addressing the over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples in the prison system, things like that, things that bring about those substantial material changes to Indigenous peoples. And so those are calls 1 to 42. Then on the other side, we have the reconciliation calls to action. And there's 17 subcategories of measures that are meant to advance the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in various sectors of society. So there's specific ones for, to educate Canadian society at large about Indigenous peoples, residential schools, and reconciliation. So calling upon different sectors of Canadian professional societies like the law schools and media and health sector to be educated adequately about Indigenous peoples and our perspectives, and then to establish these practices, policies, and actions that affirm Indigenous rights. So if you can remember one thing about, like, this is as a result of my deep dive into looking at the calls to action over the past 2 years, this will be our 3rd year doing it, just talk about in a moment. This is, there's 2 different types of calls to action that we surmised. So I was asked to speak today about some of my work on the calls to action accountability, a status update on reconciliation that my colleague, Dr. Ian Mosby, and I co-author every year and have been since 2019, but we're making it a yearly update. And so we published this at the Yellowhead Institute, which is a First Nation-led policy, a think tank, essentially, and we produce critical policy perspectives that aim to influence the conversation and to insert diverse Indigenous perspectives into the political sphere. And so, you know, this came as a result of, I think in 2016, Dr. Mosby was kind of intrigued by the fact that there wasn't really a call to action, a checklist, right? So if you don't know Dr. Ian Mosby's work, he's really great, and I highly recommend his work. He was actually the one who had produced the findings and retrieved from the archives the evidence of Canada's nutritional experiments on children in residential schools. And he published that paper, and if you remember, in around 2013, that was a huge national conversation when we, you know, were alerted to the fact that nutritional experiments were happening in these schools. And so, you know, he's very committed. He's a settler scholar, but he's very, very committed to ensuring that there's justice for Indigenous peoples and survivors of the residential schools. And so he started keeping tabs in 2016 to see how many calls to action were being completed. And nobody at this time was doing it, not even the Canadian government. So there was no website telling you about their calls to action. And CBC later started a project called Beyond 94, where they track the progress of calls to action in a different way than we do. And so on. So he just started like a Twitter thread about it. And he did this for a few years. And there was, again, not much formal attention being paid to tracking the completion of the calls to action, even though at that point, reconciliation was supposed to be, you know, the main, you know, one of the promises of the Liberal government. So, oops, I duplicated this slide. Maybe that's why I was tripping up, because that slide appears twice. Okay, so we started in 2019 looking at the accountability, how many calls to action have been completed. And in 2019, we had recorded that I believe maybe 8 or 9 had been completed. But our methodology is that some calls to action, just because it was completed one year, doesn't mean that it will necessarily be complete the next year. So one of the calls to action that we had walked back was the CBC media funding, CBC media reconciliation agenda, because some of the cuts in funding amongst CBC and the consolidation of CBC North broadcasting into just one, you know, station that was meant to serve the needs of so many hugely diverse peoples across a huge swath of land. Things like that made it so that we had no longer considered it to be complete. So each year, it's possible that a call to action can be considered incomplete based on inaction. So this is why we hold like a very critical lens and look at the accountability on the part of the Canadian government, because they can put funding in place for a 3-year block, and then after those 3 years are up and there's nothing being done about that very systemic issue that needs to continue to be funded, then we will say that particular call to action is no longer complete. So here's kind of the big ideas in our findings. In the first 5 years since the 94 calls to action were released, only 8 calls were completed. And in 2020, no calls to action were completed at all. And so that was a rate of less than 2 addressed per year. And again, reminding you, of course, that Justin Trudeau's government had stated that no relationship was more important than the ones with Indigenous peoples, and they had committed to implementing all 94 calls to action. And we had seen very clearly that the addressing the calls to action was moving at a glacial pace. It was incredibly slow. And when they were being addressed, they were addressed mostly on those sides that I had mentioned here. This is why that slide is up. So over here on the legacy side of things, we remember I talked about that real structural change. Only 2 had been completed when we were looking at it in 2020, and most of them had been completed on the reconciliation side. So we didn't actually see any of that really substantial kind of work being done to end high incarceration rates or close education gaps, or to address the health disparities that were happening, that continue to happen, or to address the extremely high rate of children who are being apprehended from their homes and their communities. What we saw and what we realized was that a lot of the calls to action that had been completed up to December 2020 were kind of window dressing. And a lot of them weren't even completed by the government themselves, So we have the adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples by churches and faith groups, the rejection of the doctrine of discovery by churches and faith groups who don't actually have any power, political power, in terms of deciding or engaging with Indigenous or Aboriginal rights, as they are called. A reconciliation agenda for the Canada Council for the Arts. One that will always be complete for as long as APTN exists is the reconciliation agenda for APTN. That's number 85. So as long as APTN exists, there will be one call to action that's been completed, right? And so that's kind of where we're at when we're looking at the calls to action. And that's a rate of less than 2. That's a rate of less than 2 addressed each year that we saw as of December 2019. And at that rate, we would have arrived at the completion of the 94 calls to action and ostensibly reconciliation in 2074. So it would take over 50 years to complete all the calls to action if we were moving at that particular pace. But I will tell you in a moment. Actually, I'll just say it now. I'll go through really quickly what the barriers were to meaningful progress, and then I'll talk about what's been happening in the last 4 weeks, because it's pretty shocking, I think. Maybe shocking is a word, I don't know. So what's the holdup? What are the barriers to this meaningful progress that we're looking for as Indigenous peoples? We're saying implement the calls to action that actually structurally and materially change our lives as Indigenous peoples. What's going on with all of that? Why continue to just pass reconciliation on the reconciliation end of things, and go for the easy low-hanging fruit, right? So we looked at about 5 different reasons as to why there are barriers to meaningful progress on the calls to action in Canada. And the first is the public interest. And so the public interest is always defined in internal Canadian memos, like I talked about a few slides ago, as the interests of a non-Indigenous public that benefits from the direct violation of treaty relationships and exploitation of Indigenous lands. So this is precisely why meaningful change like the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery or terra nullius, or giving Indigenous peoples veto power over pipeline projects and things like that aren't actually, those changes aren't made in the Canadian government, because that would mean it would impact the economy, right? And that would impact the non-Indigenous public. So take, for instance, the ongoing legal challenges to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal's September 2019 ruling that, the federal government was willfully and recklessly discriminating against First Nations children in ways that contributed to child deaths and a multitude of unnecessary family separations. So if Canadians are shocked about the continued findings of children, the graves of children outside of residential schools, I don't know what it's going to take for them to see that it's still an ongoing issue, but there's very real evidence in the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal talking about child deaths. And so Canada has publicly claimed that the order was not in the public interest. So the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal gives this ruling and they say, pay Indigenous children, First Nations children specifically, the money that you owe them and their families for all the wrongs that you committed against them. And Canada said, We can't do that because it's against the public interest, because the billions of dollars that we will need to pay out to individuals unjustly taken from their families as children is simply too high, and Canadians won't go for it. The second is paternalism. So this relates back to that, that framing of Indigenous peoples as children, which is of course a bad thing in Western worldview. When Canada attempts to respond to the calls to action, it is also without the meaningful input of Indigenous peoples. And so, for example, the acknowledgement of Indigenous language rights was completed in principle. That's one of the calls to action. And it's through the passing of the Indigenous Languages Act this year. But several concerns arose regarding the meaning of such an act when that funding doesn't even match the aspiration. And so further, there was also, concerns on the part of Inuktitut speakers who have unique challenges, and that Inuk leaders attempted to address that in the review of the bill before it was passed, but their revisions were scrapped. So much of these calls to action, the implementation of them may be unilateral, and in that way, they're gonna not be quality, right? So we have to be really, I have to be, this is my work, is to be very vigilant in watching how Canada actually implements these calls to action, because it's just, they're going to be, this is a checkbox exercise at this point, because the quantity and the number is what matters to Canadians. How many did we want to know how many were implemented, but were they quality calls to action that were implemented? Was it addressed in a way that fully addresses the concerns that came out of the Truth and Reconciliation report or volumes, things like that. Excuse me. And then structural racism. So there's no meaningful plans that have been implemented that promise to reverse the disproportionate number of Indigenous peoples in Canada's prisons, or to close the health gap that leads to shorter life expectancy for Indigenous peoples. So much of the conditions under which we are still hurting still exist, and there's no commitment to ending those structures. Another one that's been really interesting to a lot of folks, and this, I want to weave this like cautionary tale as we leave and as we move forward in this, the post revelation of children's graves around residential school sites, is that where reconciliation is supposedly happening on a national scale, non-Indigenous administrators and institutions that enact those calls to action end up marginalizing, tokenizing, and exploiting Indigenous peoples in their process. And so that's another aspect of things, is now reconciliation will become the checkbox, and how it's completed, the value and the quality of how it's completed may not necessarily match the aspiration to just get them done. The insufficient resources, there are no shortage of promises made by federal and provincial governments, and yet with the ongoing and rampant funding inequities, there can never actually be meaningful reconciliation. Another one we had talked about was political will. There's a lack of political will on the part of Canadian government and officials to actually implement the changes that Indigenous peoples are demanding. And that we've outlined in over 1,000 recommendations in the last 30 years. We've outlined what needs to happen to change and to make substantial changes for our communities to be in a place of equity with Canadians. And so the 4 calls to action that, I just want to say there's been incredible movement on the calls to action in the last 4 weeks since the first finding of children's mass graves at Kamloops on May 27th. 4 calls to action have been completed in the last 4 weeks. So if you can imagine my kind of like, whoa, like I was taken aback. Here are the 4 calls to action that have been completed, right? And these will go into our report. Our report comes out in December. So we got the citizenship oath, the Day for Truth and Reconciliation, or I should say National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, not TRC. The name change fees are waived, and official documents can now support traditional names. And a language commissioner was appointed on June 14th. Well, language commission. So there's a few folks that are have been appointed to address the Indigenous Languages Act and the structure of Indigenous languages, the focus on Indigenous languages. And then the calls to action with significant movement in the last 4 weeks. There's been 2 that I counted, but I'm sure there are more, and I'm sure I'm missing one. The Changing the Citizenship Study Guide to reflect Indigenous history has made significant movement, and the establishment and maintenance of an online registry of residential school cemeteries and plot maps showing the location of deceased residential school children. So that's more movement on the calls to action in 1 month alone than in the last 3 years as a result of what just happened and what revelations Canadians are going through. I have, you know, this audience here is, as I understand it, are Indigenous folks. So in the interest of keeping time for questions and things like that, I'm going to skip this next question, which is focused on Canadians, kind of the hand wringing that Canadians do after they hear me talk, because I'm assuming that many of you are, of course, you know, Indigenous like I am, Anishinaabe. So I'm going to focus and move on here and say, you know, to Anishinaabe, you know, my fellow Indigenous women, I just want to say that we are strong. And, you know, we embody with our very existence resistance to settler colonialism. But it's okay not to feel okay in this moment. And coping in however you do is the best you can do in this moment. And you are valid and you're valuable. You don't owe any Canadian your energy, but it is cathartic to use your voice too. And you give permission for others to use their voice. And your energy is sacred and you have the right to rest. You have the right to resist and you have the right to rest. So I wanted to end off on those notes because a lot of people have been asking me, you know, in the media, what would you say to Canadians? What would you say to Canadians? But nobody has ever asked me, what would you say to your own community? And so I just wanted to say that. And of course, it comes with some emotion because, you know, it means a lot to me that I've been able to come and share with you some of the knowledge and the research that I do. The work that I do out of a labor of love for my community and my family and my ancestors and of course, my descendants. So I always end off with a picture of Janice, my daughter. And I just want to say to you, Chimiigwech for having me. I'm happy to take questions now. And thank you so much for taking this time to listen to my work. Miigwech.
And so we have a question for you. This one says, thank you so much. As a non-Indigenous person here, where can I start? What can I actually do to be an effective ally without just participating in tokenism or symbolic activity that doesn't actually change anything?
Well, I guess I skipped over the slides for that. And I guess, well, to just go back to my slides. I won't pull the slideshow back up, but what I do say to Canadians who ask me that is that you need to hold your government accountable. So you need to make some real substantial action in terms of writing your MP and showing your, you know, you're a constituent of a riding somewhere. You have to show them that you are not apathetic because they're counting on your apathy, right? So make those meaningful and self-aware steps to learning more and to creating change with that. Be an active citizen and be, we need you to stand up for us. If you're going to encounter folks in your communities who are, have anti-Indigenous sentiment and racism, stand up for us. So those are 2 things I can think of right now: concrete action and don't be silent.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I wanted to add to that, just being here, and learning is so huge, and it's just showing that you care. But we get that asked all the time as activists in our community. What can we do? How can we help? And, all we ask of you is to educate. Once you learn, your job is then to share what you've learned to your community, whether your community is your house, your children, the next generation. It's so important because education of our Indigenous people was hidden away from adults my age in the 60s 50s, 40s, 30s. You know, it's only been about 20 years or less that, you know, a lot of the work of a lot of our ancestors and people in my age range who found their voices before, for example, before I did, started demanding that, you know, the reality of our people is to be taught in the schools. The reality of residential schools to be taught in the schools. It has been all that long that First Nations workers are hired within the schools with a limited capacity to try to work with our children, and I'm one of those people. So yeah, just basically, once you learn something, it's your job then to educate or try to educate wherever you can. We don't ask you to walk out there and become activists and speak out on behalf of our people. That's the last thing that we want, you know, to be a voice for our people. But just to speak up for us when you can, when you have the opportunity, is probably the best way. And join us. And like one of our speakers said, stand beside us when we do take action. You stand with us. And, you know, the numbers speak everything to government. So those numbers mean a lot. So thank you so much. We had another question is, what brought you into this level of education, you know, in terms of wanting to help our people?
Oh, that's an awesome question. Thank you for asking. You know, when I was about 12 or 13, my mom, we lived in my community on Chippewa Thames First Station. My mom's an artist and she wanted to, you know, she's around, I suppose she was about 40 or 41. And she wanted to go to school to learn. She wanted to go to art school. She wanted to learn more about being an artist. And she also was so devastated with there was a lot of suicides in our community at the time. And she was inspired to learn. So she went to the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And so of course our whole family packed up and went to Santa Fe. Of course, we moved to Santa Fe and she started school there. And when I was finishing high school, I didn't know what to do with my life. I was kind of like, I don't know, maybe I'll just be a waitress for the rest of my life or a barista, because I just had like a job scooping ice cream. I really didn't know what I was going to do. And my mom said, just go to school at IAIA, you know, the Institute of American Indian Arts, just see if you'll like it. I said, I'm not an artist though. I'm not as good as you, Mom. And she said, no, they have a new program. It's called Indigenous Liberal Studies. Just try it out, see if you like it. Just one semester. And actually I was still not 18 yet. And so, so I went to school and she was in her last year. So me and my sister actually started school at the same time. So I started my college education with my sister, my mom, and we were all at the same school at an Indigenous school in Santa Fe. And I went there and I loved it. I fell in love with it. Everything just made so much sense to me. I was starting to learn like just everything. When you start to learn, it just all comes to you, right? So I graduated there with a degree in Indigenous Liberal Studies, and then I decided to keep going because I was encouraged by my mentors who are all Indigenous Anishinaabe mentors, and they said to me, "You can go to graduate school." So I applied for graduate school. I went to do my Master of Arts in Indigenous Governance at the University of Victoria. And, you know, I finished that up and all my mentors there were like, why don't you go do your PhD? And I thought, I don't know. So I took a year off. I went home to work for my community. My daughter was young at the time. I had my daughter in graduate school. I worked for my First Nation, and the chief of my First Nation at the time said, you should do your PhD. And so I decided I would. So I did. And I chose a program that I was able to stay home in my community and did the virtual learning. At that time, it was novel. Not everybody was doing it at the time. And I got to work and complete some work for my community in terms of how do we reclaim our original governance structures. So I completed my PhD in 2018, and I received and I started at X University in 2019. So it all started with my mom making the moves, as often these things often start. Thank you for your question.
So would you say that the more education you got around our people, change your own perspective of our Indigenous history, of, you know, yourself as, you know, where you are in your life at the time and now?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear that question. Sorry.
I keep forgetting about the microphone. Yeah, so would you say that the higher level you go in terms of your education, how does that change your perspective of yourself as an Indigenous person?
I think it definitely gives you more context to understanding what conditions were there when you were growing up. I never knew why my dad was so, you know, he was an angry guy. And, you know, my family members, like my grandpa and all the men in my family were so angry and they were abusive. And I didn't know, I just thought they were all jerks, right? And so I came to realize then that, you know, my dad went to day school. I went to day school. My mom went to day school. But he was raised by a residential school survivor, right? So like how that trauma kind of impacts through the generations, it gave me so much more context to understanding myself. And I want to note too that I see and see a lot of Indigenous students, you know, really struggling because they're in these Canadian institutions that aren't Indigenous spaces. But I owe all of my my ongoing inability to continue my education to the fact that I started in an Indigenous institution. So I started at an all Indigenous school, and I went to grad school in an all Indigenous program, and how critically important these programs are to our peoples, to have safe spaces to sit and to talk and to mull over and to really process all of that information is so vital. So I'm such an advocate for Indigenous spaces of learning.
Yeah, thank you for that. We have one more question. How much, in your opinion, is the current modern K-12 system styled or framed on the priest-nun boarding school model?
That's a really good question. I think there is still a lot of misopotic tendencies that exist in Canadian society. And it's still present in school systems today. And again, Toby Rojo is a scholar that does some work on this actually, how it shows up in the school system. And he's actually refuses to send his children to the school system because of how they still contain this denigration of childhood. There is still a core assumption that children don't know anything and they need to be educated in the ways of, you know, of enlightenment to be forced into maturity. It's just not done so much with that overt violence anymore. And I hope that things, you know, can change for children. But the fact that we send children away to school for most of their days, for most of their lives, really, to be with, you know, another person and with other children, I think is reflective of a settler colonial system. And we have to send our kids out to school so we can work, you know, because so settler colonialism also works very closely with, settler colonialism gives rise to capitalism, and capitalism keeps settler colonialism in place. But we're all these, you know, capitalist subjects. So we have to go to work 9 to 5 to earn a living. And so you can't go to work, as many people understood, you know, of course, in the pandemic, it's very difficult to juggle work and care for children. So we're in a system still that structurally keeps children and excludes them from our care. And many of us don't actually know how to be parents, you know, and parent for peace or parent for full time, which is why there's so much burnout during the pandemic, because we were expected to carry on our normal duties of work in you know, the capitalist system while still while caring for our children. And so I don't know. It's something that I'm still thinking through quite a bit, but I do think that the K-12 system still absolutely contains, and it's still a system that is rooted in the denigration of childhood.
Thank you. And something that we haven't asked, but I think over the past 2 days, we've heard a lot of non-Indigenous people, you know, feeling pain over our experience, feeling pain and shame over the findings of all the children over the past while. So how would you respond to that? How would you respond to that pain?
I think it's a really natural and human response. You know, I would be kind of worried if Canadians weren't pained by it. I just think that, you know, I really, really do understand when a lot of folks are really pained by it. Though I think that you can't really call upon Indigenous peoples to listen to your pain, or you can't, you know, kind of do this moment. Like, I know you want to cathartically put it somewhere or just tell a random Indigenous person you're sorry. And that may feel like it's doing something for you, but it actually, I don't think that's necessarily the best solution. I think there is this idea called contrition, which is the apologetic space of action. So if you're pained and you're feeling bad, put that into action and make a change in the society. So I think pain and grief is a really generative space, and I think it's natural. And I'm not going to blame anyone who feels that pain or that grief, but don't burden Indigenous peoples with your pain and grief, because we're already feeling our own, and do something with it, make action with it.
Yeah, that's the perfect answer. My mother used to always tell me to keep busy, always keep busy. And as a survivor, you know, she saw my depression, my loneliness, that I became a loner. She used to always tell me, get up and do something. And so that stuck in my head. When I fall into my depression, I could feel it coming out like a chemical. I'll get up and make a big batch of fry bread, bake it to the downtown east side, and they're so grateful that's my medicine. So that's the perfect answer to our non-Indigenous allies. I've been burdened with this question, and but over time it's getting so often that you kind of start running out of answers, you know. So yeah, thank you for that. So on behalf of the Pacific Association of First Nations Women, we thank you for honoring us with your presence, for sharing your knowledge, your truth-telling to the people and all of those online. So we'd like to honor you with a big applause right from our audience. So if you have a few closing words for us, that'd be awesome.
Thank you everyone for having me. And it's been such a pleasure to share my knowledge with folks, and take good care the rest of this week. Take good care of yourselves.
And to close, we have Diana.
And yeah, just hearing from Dr. Eva Jewell as well too today, that was good. And Claudette Commanda, how great was that? I was so thankful that we got an opportunity to hear from her, and she was able to share some of her wisdom and her teachings, and looking forward to hearing more. There's so much wealth in our nations, and I'm so thankful that we had the opportunity to share this with mainstream and with our own people, and very thankful for the funding that we received from Rio Tinto to be able to bring our community together from across Turtle Island. I'm looking forward to doing some more of this kind of work, some more education works. Please follow us on Facebook and like our page. We have a lot going on. We're going to be implementing the Champions Against Racism program, and we're hoping to create an army of allies, people who are working within mainstream, people who are in mainstream, and who can connect with other people and start to educate and share information about our people, so that we can dispel the myths and the stereotypes that are out there, and that some people are so inclined to believe. So we've got a lot of work to do. I'm so thankful to be with the Pacific Association of First Nations Women, and with our board of directors that we have. Darlene Kelly's our president, and we have Cheryl Simpkins. She's a transit police sergeant, and she's on our board as well as Amanda Kai, who's now the director of operations at the Native Education College here, that Tamara Starblanket had mentioned. And we have Emily Baker, who's in finance, now on our board as well as Paula Potter. Paula Potter's a pipe carrier and has some really awesome lived experience. We're doing some wonderful work. We have a donation on our website. We have scholarships and bursaries that we're wanting to create more so that we can give education opportunities to more of our people. And it was so nice to hear from Tamara and Dr. Eva Jewell talking about their educational journey and how that started and began. So we want to support more of our women to be able to reach those higher levels of education and to be able to set role models, set examples for our people and dispel those myths that are out there. Tonight we're having a language celebration. Language was mentioned so much here, and we have a Korean Ojibwe language program that we're offering. We've offered it for 3 years now, and very sad to say that one of our language instructors, Dorothy Eastman, has passed away. She was a Saulteaux Anishinaabe woman and with us for 3 years since the beginning of our program. So we're going to have a celebration for her this evening, celebration of life, as well as a graduation for those students who have taken time out of their lives to reclaim their language and to learn their language. So please follow us on Facebook and also on Twitter. We're also on Twitter too, at PAFNW, our acronym. We changed our name the time that AFN changed their name. We want it to be AFNW, and we put a P in the front for Pacific, because we were once the Professional Native Women's Association. So we wanted to keep that P in there. So I'm so thankful, so grateful. Thank you, Kat, for holding everything together. And thank you to Justine from Feminist Deliver, who was able to support us as well. And Sophia as our tech support. Dale Lessaway, who was running the camera for us. And he's a Métis on our team. And we also have Jessica on our team who was presenting with her mother and grandmother. That was so nice to see. So very thankful for all the support that we've received, and share this information with people that are in your circle so that they can help to learn and grow. And a special thank you to all those people from mainstream who are non-Indigenous, who did take time out from their lives to spend with us and to learn more about us. And I hope that you can share what you've learned with others to help change the current narrative that we have going on, to make sure that we're all being supported, we're all being lifted up to the rightful place where we need to be. So Nyawango, thank you so much for coming, and we look forward to connecting with you further. And there's some links in the chat box there to follow us on Facebook and about some of the other work that we're having coming up. We are doing some work with the Residential School Survivors Society as well too. We have a Vancouver Indigenous Community Response Network that's looking at, we're going to be meeting very shortly, the next couple of weeks, to look at planning some events to support the survivors of residential school with all of the news that's coming out. We also need opportunities for people to express their anger and their frustration and because there's a lot of that is happening as well too. So we need space for that. So just thinking about all the opportunities that we have coming up. Thank you once again, and look forward to seeing you all somewhere, sometime. Bye for now.